My husband left me after I tried to protect his brother from a cheating wife. 3 years later, he called me sobbing because that same woman destroyed his life too. He had once looked me in the eye and told me to keep quiet, told me that what I saw, his sister, sneaking around with another man, wasn't my business, that I had no right to interfere. When I didn't stay silent, when I chose to tell the truth, he turned his back on me, kicked me out, let his family call me a liar. They said I was tearing the family apart, that I was jealous, bitter, unstable. But I knew what I saw. I knew the truth. Now, after years of cutting me off, he wants my help because karma didn't just catch up, it slammed into him like a freight train. The woman he defended robbed him blind, his sister betrayed him, and me? I'm just getting started telling the story. Back then, we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Chris and I had been married for nearly a decade. We met at a charity fundraiser, the kind of event where people come for the wine and small talk, not to find their forever person. But there he was, standing near the donation booth, laughing with a stranger like he had all the time in the world. His confidence wasn't loud, but it filled the room. And when he walked up to me and asked about the book I was holding, I didn't stand a chance. We moved fast. Within a year, we were living together. The next, we were married in a small ceremony under a maple tree in Vermont, just the two of us in our closest circle. It felt intimate, solid, right. Our home was filled with lazy Sunday mornings and burnt pancakes, cozy movie nights, and long drives to nowhere. Chris had a stable job in finance while I worked as a marketing executive at a demanding startup. My schedule was brutal, early calls, late nights. But he always said he admired my work ethic, that he was proud of me. When I started talking about needing a break, he didn't hesitate. Take it, he said. Take care of yourself. I've got us. That moment is burned into my memory because I believed him. His family, especially his sister Rachel, was a huge part of our lives. Rachel was older, loud, in that confident, commanding way. Everyone adored her. Her two kids, her pristine house, her curated Instagram life. It was all very on brand. Her husband, Ben, was quieter, calm, successful. I liked him more than I liked her. He had a groundedness that reminded me of my own father. I was close to the kids. They called me Aunt Ivy, and they meant it. I went to their soccer games, taught them how to bake banana bread, and helped with school projects. I poured love into those children because they were easy to love. And even though Rachel often treated me like I was just barely tolerated, I tried. I played the good sister-in-law, brought wine to family dinners, smiled through passive-aggressive jabs, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, all because I loved Chris, and Chris loved them. Sometimes I wondered if he loved them more than me. Still, we had our life, our routines, our future plans. We talked about trying for a baby in a year or two. We had a travel bucket list. We dreamed aloud about opening a small cafe once we retired, him managing books, me baking, silly things that couples dream up on wine-soaked evenings, but they felt real at the time. When I finally stepped away from my job, it was the first time in over a decade that I chose myself. It felt terrifying, but also empowering. Chris cheered me on, told me to rest, to heal, that he'd handled the money stuff for a while. We kept our accounts separate for personal spending. The joint account was for household expenses, groceries, mortgage, date nights. He earned more, so he contributed more, but we both added the same percentage of our income. It was fair, balanced. And I had my savings. I was proud of that. I planned everything carefully before quitting. I didn't want to be a burden. I never asked him to pick up my slack because there wasn't any. So when things started to shift, I didn't understand why. But that came later. In those early months, I still believed we were solid. I still thought we were partners. Now, looking back, I realized I was holding up the whole thing by myself. The shift wasn't dramatic at first. It crept in like a draft through a cracked window, barely noticeable until you started shivering. Chris stopped looking me in the eye during breakfast. When I'd ask if he wanted to do takeout, he'd scoff again, as if I were being lazy or reckless. When I suggested we go out for dinner after I'd had a tough day, he'd mutter something about unnecessary spending. And it didn't stop there. Even when I spent my own money from my personal savings, I'd catch him watching me like I was making a mistake. At first, I thought it was just stress. Maybe work was getting to him. Maybe he felt pressure being the sole income earner, even temporarily. So I backed off. I cooked more, stopped suggesting dinners out, tried to be understanding. But his behavior only got worse. He began snapping at me over tiny things: an extra light left on, a laundry load done at the wrong time, the kind of trivial irritations that wouldn't have mattered before. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. Walking on eggshells became routine. I counted my words, watched my tone, rehearsed requests in my head to make sure they wouldn't trigger another cold silence or sarcastic remark. The man who once made me feel safe now made me feel small. The finances were the final blow. I logged into the joint account one morning just to check on the usual bills and saw numbers that didn't add up. Huge withdrawals, strange transfers. I asked him about it, assuming there was a logical explanation. There wasn't. He sat me down without eye contact, of course, and confessed that he'd been gambling for months. Said it started as a distraction, a harmless outlet during the early weeks of my hiatus, but it spiraled fast. By the time he realized how deep he was in, he was too ashamed to tell me. We were nearly bankrupt. Our house was on the verge of foreclosure. Everything we'd worked for was crumbling, and I had no idea. I couldn't even cry. I was too stunned. I felt betrayed, gutted, humiliated, and worse, he didn't even look that sorry. He looked embarrassed, like a teenager caught stealing from his parents' wallet, not a grown man who'd jeopardized our entire future. I didn't want to worry you, he said, as if that made it better. I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded, got up, and walked out of the room. The next morning, I applied for jobs like a woman possessed. I emailed every recruiter I'd ever known, reactivated my LinkedIn, and by some stroke of fate, landed an interview 2 days later and then a job offer the same week. The salary was decent. The benefits are great. I took it without hesitation. I also called Ben. I didn't want to. I knew how much Chris hated the idea, said it would make him look weak to his brother-in-law, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let his ego drown us both. Ben, to his credit, didn't ask questions. He just helped, quietly, efficiently, without judgment. We paid off the most urgent debts, got the house off the repossession list. It was a lifeline. But instead of gratitude, Chris gave me fury. "You'll emasculate me," he snapped one night. "You went behind my back." That's when I realized he didn't see me as a partner anymore. He saw me as a threat to his image. The man who once told me he admired my strength now resented me for using it. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about control. After that night, something in me snapped. I started noticing all the ways he'd tried to chip away at my sense of worth, the subtle critiques disguised as concern, the dismissive sighs when I offered ideas or opinions, the way he'd smirk when I got emotional, like my feelings were some performance he was too bored to watch. I wasn't just disappointed, I was angry. At him for his lies, at myself for letting it get this far. He used to hold my hand during storms, whispering that everything would be okay. Now he was the storm, and I was tired of drowning. We managed to stabilize things financially over the next few months, mostly thanks to my new job and Ben's quiet generosity. I was still furious at Chris, but the urgency of keeping us afloat left little room for processing emotions. I was in survival mode, scheduling payments, organizing our accounts, managing the house. And he sulked, moped around the house like the victim of some unfair tragedy, never once fully acknowledging the mess he had made. We repaid Ben every cent within the year, and still, Chris carried a chip on his shoulder, bitter that his secret had been exposed, bitter that I had shamed him by reaching out to someone else for help. Still, I tried. I didn't want to resent the man I once loved. I held on to the idea that things could get better. I believed that if we could get through this, maybe there was something left to rebuild. But that belief died the day I saw Rachel with another man. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I had just baked a batch of lemon tarts. Rachel's kids loved them and decided to drop some off at their house. She opened the door with a forced smile, unusually flustered, and rushed me out the moment I handed her the box. My gut told me something was off. I sat in my car down the street and waited. 10 minutes later, a man came out, baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses on, his body language screaming secrecy. He didn't look up once. Rachel followed him to the door, gave him a quick kiss, then shut it behind her like nothing had happened. My chest burned, not just from anger, but disbelief. How could she, after everything Ben had done for her, for all of them, and worse, how could Chris, the same man who worshipped his sister, not see this? Drove home in silence, shaking. When Chris walked in that evening, I told him everything, every detail. I expected shock, maybe fury, at least some level of disbelief. Instead, he went pale, then quiet, and finally, after a long pause, he asked, "Did you tell anyone else?" I blinked. "What?" He exhaled. "Please, don't say anything. You have no idea what's going on." My heart dropped. "Are you serious right now? Rachel's cheating on Ben. You think I should just let that slide?" "We don't know that," he said quickly. "It could be something else. You're jumping to conclusions." "No," I said flatly. "I saw what I saw. That wasn't a handyman or an old friend. She kissed him." Chris rubbed his temples. "Look, even if she is, maybe they have some kind of agreement. You don't know their marriage." I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You're defending her. I'm saying it's not our place." It hit me then, the way he was stonewalling, rationalizing, the way he always protected Rachel, the way he was so desperate to keep this quiet. He wasn't just protecting her, he was protecting himself. "You're hiding something," I whispered. Chris flinched. "Don't start." But I couldn't let it go. If it were me, if I were cheating, "You'd want someone to tell you. Don't you think Ben deserves the same?" He refused to answer, just sat there, lips pressed, eyes distant. I decided that night I would tell Ben. I tried to give Chris one more chance to support me. The next day I told him again that I was going to talk to Ben. This time he exploded. "You're going to ruin everything," he shouted. "You don't get it. Families are complicated. You don't have siblings. You don't understand." We fought for hours. Words flew like knives. At one point I screamed, "Are you cheating too? Is that why this hits so close to home?" He went silent, and that silence was louder than any confession. I went to Ben's house the next day. I hoped Rachel would be there. I wanted her to look me in the eye and deny it, but she wasn't. So I told him everything. He didn't cry, not then. He just nodded, lips trembling, and thanked me. "I've suspected something," he said quietly, "but I had no proof." "I don't either," I admitted, "just what I saw. But my gut, it knew." He hugged me before I left. No anger, no drama, just pain. Rachel must have found out soon after because 2 days later she showed up at my door, screaming. She called me every name imaginable, accused me of trying to destroy her family, said I was jealous, vindictive, desperate for attention. I didn't say much, just stood there, arms crossed, watching her unravel. "You did this to yourself," I said finally. "Don't blame me for your mess." Chris didn't speak to me for days after that. His silence was punishment, but I didn't care anymore. Something in me had broken, but something else had woken up. The version of me that used to keep quiet to keep the peace was gone. And then came the final blow. Chris started turning the rest of the family against me quietly behind my back. He told his mother that I had made up lies about Rachel out of jealousy, that I was unstable, obsessed, and trying to manipulate Ben Heard about it from a cousin who still liked me. They're painting you as some bitter woman trying to break up the family, she said. I didn't believe them, but Ivy, they're convincing. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Rachel cheating. This was about control, loyalty, power, and I was their threat. They didn't want the truth, they wanted silence. And when I wouldn't give it, they turned me into the enemy. But I was done playing that role. I wasn't the villain, I was the one who finally said what everyone else was too afraid to admit. And for that, I would never apologize. The silence in our house became suffocating. Chris and I barely spoke. When we did, it was through clipped phrases and loaded glances. He stopped coming home on time, and when he did, he'd collapse on the couch with his phone glued to his hand, pretending I wasn't there. I stopped trying to talk, stopped asking questions. I just existed, moved around him like furniture. And yet, I still held on to hope. Some part of me believed that if we could just get through this rough patch, maybe we could find our way back. I thought about the early days, Sunday pancakes, late night grocery runs, dancing barefoot in the kitchen. I missed that man. I missed being that one. But I couldn't bring her back. She was gone, buried under months of exhaustion and hurt. What made it worse was the way the family treated me. Rachel, of course, had declared war, but now Chris's mother and father had joined the crusade. They stopped inviting me to dinners, stopped returning my messages. When I ran into his mom at the grocery store, she looked at me like I was poison. They believed I'd torn the family apart. They didn't care that Rachel had cheated. They didn't care that I had saved their son from financial ruin. All they saw was a woman who dared to speak the truth. I'd go to work, smile through meetings, power through presentations, and then come home and cry in the shower just to get it out before bed. I was exhausted, emotionally bankrupt. Some nights I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder, is this my life now? Just surviving? I started doubting myself. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I should have handled things differently. Maybe Chris was right. Maybe I didn't understand family loyalty. I spiraled into self-blame the way so many women do when they're gaslit for too long. Then came the final confirmation. I found a receipt in his jacket pocket, 2 drinks, 1 entree, a hotel room, dated the weekend he'd told me he was visiting a friend for support. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. The truth was already screaming. He was cheating. Of course he was. The guilt, the defensiveness, the sudden obsession with Rachel's privacy. It all made sense now. He had been protecting her because he was doing the same thing. And worse, I had been helping him rebuild a life he was secretly sharing with someone else. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried like I hadn't in years. Not because I lost him. I had already lost him long ago. I cried because I had spent so long believing that love meant loyalty, even to people who didn't deserve it. I cried for the version of me that used to beg for scraps of affection. I cried for the woman who once thought she needed to be quiet to be loved. Then I stood up, wiped my face, and stared at myself in the mirror for a long, long time. I looked tired, hollow, but there was something else too, something sharp and steady in my eyes. Resolve. I wasn't going to beg anymore. The next day, I called a divorce attorney. I didn't tell Chris. I wanted the paperwork ready before he even knew what was happening. I spent the next few weeks in stealth mode, gathering documents, logging finances, building my case. I started sleeping in the guest room just to put some emotional distance between us. Chris noticed, of course, but he said nothing. Maybe he thought I was finally breaking. Maybe that's what he wanted. But I wasn't breaking. I was preparing. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the lies or the silence or even the cheating. It was mourning a future that would never exist. I had imagined growing old with Chris. I had imagined a home filled with laughter, with kids, with lazy mornings and loud holidays. I pictured a life where We'd look back one day and say, we made it through, but that dream had died. And dreams don't die quietly, they scream as they burn. Everywhere I went, I carried that ache. At the grocery store when I passed the cereal he liked, at the movies when I sat alone because I couldn't bear to share my space with someone else yet, in the car parked in our driveway where I'd sit with the engine running just to avoid walking into a house that no longer felt like mine. There were days I wanted to give up, to let him win, to let the narrative they'd spun become the truth. But something deeper kept me going, a whisper that said, "You still matter. You still deserve peace." And even if no one else believed me, I knew the truth. I hadn't broken our family. I had to stop pretending it was whole. Filing for divorce felt like shedding a skin I had outgrown years ago. The day I handed my attorney the signed documents, something shifted inside me. It wasn't joy, far from it. It was relief. Like I had finally stopped gaslighting myself into believing that staying was noble. Chris barely reacted when he was served. He called that evening, voice tight with disbelief. So you're just giving up? I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I let the silence speak for me. In the weeks that followed, I reclaimed my space piece by piece. I started with the bedroom, replaced the sheets, moved his things into storage boxes, bought a new lamp that cast warm light instead of the harsh, cold blue he always preferred. I painted the walls a soft olive green and opened the windows, even on cold mornings, just to feel something fresh. Then I tackled the rest, donated furniture we picked together, rearranged bookshelves, removed wedding photos. My home, like my life, was undergoing a quiet revolution. Work became a sanctuary. I threw myself into projects, offered to lead new initiatives, and for the first time in a long time, I felt useful again. Not just competent, but valuable. My boss noticed. She called me into her office one Friday afternoon and offered me a promotion. I nearly cried right there in front of her. "Whatever you're doing," she said with a grin, "keep doing it." I did. I also started going to therapy. It was awkward at first. I didn't know how to sit still with my own pain without minimizing it. But my therapist helped me peel back the layers, helped me name things I'd never dared admit: emotional abuse, control, isolation. She showed me that I hadn't just been hurt, I'd been conditioned to accept the hurt as normal. That revelation was both freeing and devastating. I joined a local women's group. We met every Wednesday at a cozy little bookstore cafe. Some were divorced, some widowed, some single by choice, but all were healing. We shared stories, tears, laughter, recipes. I made friends there, real friends, the kind who showed up when your tire blows out, or when you needed someone to help carry a couch up 3 flights of stairs. They reminded me I wasn't alone. One evening after group, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine and watched the sunset melt into amber. My phone buzzed with a message from Ben. "Just checking in. How are you doing?" We hadn't talked much since everything went down, but he'd stayed cordial, respectful. I texted back, "Better, thank you." He replied, "I'm glad. You deserve peace." I stared at the screen for a long time, then smiled. Healing didn't come in one big moment, it came in pieces. In deciding not to cry over a voicemail, in sleeping through the night without nightmares, in learning to cook for one and still lighting a candle at dinner. It came in forgiving myself for staying too long, for not seeing the signs, for believing love meant sacrifice. It came in setting boundaries with Chris, with his family, with anyone who thought they had a right to my time, my energy, my forgiveness. By the time the divorce was finalized, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt whole, scarred, but whole. Chris moved out a week later. He didn't say goodbye. He left his key in a bowl by the door and texted me, "Take care." I didn't reply because I was finally too busy taking care of myself. There were still hard days, Some mornings I'd wake up and forget for a split second that I was alone. I'd reach across the bed and feel the emptiness beside me like a slap. Other days, I'd catch a scent, his cologne on an old jacket I forgot to donate, and my chest would tighten without warning. But those moments passed, and every time they did, I felt a little stronger. I took a short trip alone to the coast, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the space to. I walked along the cliffs at sunrise, the wind tangling my hair, the salt air stinging my face, and I cried not from sadness, but from release. I had survived something that nearly erased me. And now I was writing the rest of my story, not as someone's wife, not as someone's daughter-in-law, just as me, happy. I didn't know what came next, but for once, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It thrilled me because it was mine to decide. The message came out of nowhere. 3 years had passed since the divorce. I had moved states, built a new life, even started my own consulting business. Things were stable, quiet even. My days were filled with coffee-fueled meetings, late-night strategy calls, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing no one is waiting to criticize you for simply existing. Then, one rainy afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to the message. It was Chris. He was sobbing, not just sniffles, but raw, choking sobs, the kind that barely allow room for words. Ivy, please, I need your help. I don't know what else to do. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I should have deleted it. I should have blocked the number and moved on. But curiosity, that old itch, made me text back one simple word. Why? He called within seconds. I answered, not because I cared, but because I wanted to hear the story for myself. Turned out, Chris had remarried to a woman named Sienna, Rachel's friend, 21, gorgeous, wide-eyed, a girl who had once babysat Rachel's kids and idolized the whole family dynamic. Chris said it had been refreshing to be admired again, that Sienna made him feel young and appreciated. Right? He went on and on about how the marriage had started off perfect, lavish trips, joint Instagram accounts, brunch every weekend, until one day, both Sienna and Rachel vanished. And so did his money. They had emptied his accounts, everything, savings, checking, even investments, gone. The police later informed him that both women were fine and didn't want to be contacted. They were spotted in Europe posting luxurious selfies, shopping in Paris, sipping cocktails on the Amalfi Coast. Chris was devastated, betrayed, broke. You were right about her, he mumbled. You were right about all of it. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, I told you the truth, you punished me for it. He tried to shift the conversation. Do you think you could help me figure out my finances again? You were always good at that. That's when I laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that tastes like justice. You want me to save you again? I asked. After everything? He went quiet. I could hear the humiliation vibrating through the phone. IV, he said, voice low, I have no one. You had me, I replied, but you chose her, you chose them, and now you can lie in the bed you made. I hung up, and it felt incredible. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not cruel, not vindictive, just free. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, I got a call from his mother. Apparently, things were worse than I thought. Sienna's parents were threatening to press charges, claiming Chris had groomed her, started seeing her before she turned 18. She was now saying she'd been manipulated, that he'd used his age and power to control her. Suddenly, the family that once treated me like garbage was begging me for help. Because I was a lawyer, because I understood how to handle things, because I was still family in some way. I nearly choked on my coffee. I'm not his lawyer, I told her coldly. I'd be happy to testify against him, if that's what it comes to. But you know him, she said, almost sobbing. You know he's not. I knew who he pretended to be, I said, not who he is. And then I blocked her number. That night, I lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and sat on my porch watching the rain fall. I wasn't celebrating his downfall. I was celebrating my escape. I had walked through fire and they tried to burn me for it. But now, I was the storm. I shared the voicemail with my therapist during our next session. She smiled, not out of amusement, but in recognition. "It's not about you anymore," she said. "He's reaching for the last version of himself that felt stable. And that was you. But that doesn't mean he deserves you." Her words stuck with me. Because for years I thought closure would come in a conversation, an apology, some cinematic ending where he'd finally understand what he did. But this was closure. Watching him face the chaos he once justified. Hearing him say I was right, not as a triumph, but as a confession. The world had flipped. I was no longer the one begging to be heard. He was, and I didn't need to listen anymore. That week, I treated myself to a new apartment, smaller, brighter, all mine. I bought fresh linens, repainted the walls, planted herbs in the kitchen window. I even adopted a dog, a rescue mutt named Olive, who followed me everywhere like I was her hero. Maybe I was. For her and for myself. When people ask if I ever regret what happened, I say no. Because the worst thing he ever did was give me the opportunity to rebuild. And I did, brick by brick, stronger, smarter, louder than ever. He lost everything. And I found myself. The last time I saw Chris, he looked like a shadow of the man I once married. As a chance encounter, pure accident, I was visiting my old hometown for a legal seminar, grabbing a coffee before heading to the courthouse, when I spotted him at a dingy gas station on the edge of town. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and the glimmer in his eyes was gone. He didn't see me, but I stood there for a minute, watching from a distance long enough to hear him arguing with the cashier about a declined card. I should have walked away immediately, but something in me needed to witness it, not out of revenge, not even out of satisfaction, just confirmation. The man who once laughed at my pain, who let his family destroy me, who defended a cheater and betrayed me in the same breath, he was no longer untouchable. He had fallen. Hard. Word had reached me through mutual contacts that things had gone from bad to worse. After the scandal with Sienna, no firm would hire him. He burned through his savings, tried moving in with his parents, but even they were struggling. Downsizing to a one-bedroom apartment after Rachel drained them helping pay for lawyers. Rachel, too, had been left out in the cold. Ben won full custody and she wasn't even granted overnight visits for the first year. Her attempt to file for spousal support backfired when evidence of her affair surfaced in court. She worked part-time at a local diner now, living in a cramped apartment above a pawn shop. None of them reached out again. The silence was the sweetest apology they could ever give me. Ben, on the other hand, was thriving. We weren't close, we had gone our separate ways, but I heard through mutual friends that he'd remarried, had another child, and even expanded his business. When asked about Rachel, he simply said, "That chapter is closed." For me, I kept growing. I spoke at women's panels, hosted workshops on financial recovery after divorce, and started mentoring younger women in my field. Every story I told, every truth I shared, chipped away at the shame I used to carry. I became the woman I once needed. And Chris, he became a cautionary tale. When I think of him now, I don't feel anger. I feel pity, because he could have had peace, he could have had growth, partnership, love. Instead, he clung to pride and lies, and it cost him everything. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come wearing a name you used to say with love. One of the most surreal moments came during a fundraiser event I spoke at just a month after that accidental sighting. A woman approached me after my speech, nervous, clutching a notepad. "Are you Ivy Matthews?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated. "You don't know me, but I used to date Chris, briefly, after his second divorce." My breath caught for a second, but I didn't flinch. "Okay." He told me I reminded him of his first wife, of you. I blinked. She laughed, a little bitter. He said you were the smartest woman he ever knew and the one he hurt the most. I didn't get it then, but I do now. He's a mess. I didn't need her validation, but it was poetic in its own strange way. Chris had spent years trying to replace me, not realizing I'd already moved so far beyond him that we weren't even walking the same timeline anymore. That night, I went home and wrote down a sentence I now keep on my desk. You are not responsible for the wreckage someone else creates when they abandon their own soul. Let them drown in their consequences. You swim toward the sun and never look back. It's quiet now. Not the kind of quiet that feels like loneliness, but the kind that fills a room like soft light in the morning. The kind that hums beneath a favorite song or settles in your chest after a good laugh. That's the quiet I live in now. I've built a life where I no longer flinch at phone calls, where I don't pace the room, wondering if I said too much or not enough, where I sleep deeply, dream freely, and wake up grateful. Ivy Matthews, 39, divorced, survivor, lawyer, mentor, friend. So the past still visits sometimes, in dreams, in unexpected smells, in random photos that surface when I'm cleaning out drawers, but it no longer holds power over me. It no longer defines who I am or what, and that's the difference. Love, I've learned, is not sacrifice. It's not silence. It's not endurance. It's honesty, partnership, peace. I haven't dated seriously since Chris. I've had a few flings, a few coffees that turned into dinners, and even one short relationship with a professor who quoted poetry and brought me sunflowers, but nothing that made me want to share my life again. Not yet. But I'm open to the idea now, not because I need someone to complete me, but because I finally feel complete on my own. Anything else would be a bonus. One morning last spring, I sat on the porch with Olive at my feet, a mug of coffee in hand, and watched the sun break over the horizon. A breeze rustled the wind chimes, and I felt this rush of peace so deep it brought tears to my eyes. It had taken years to get here. Through pain, betrayal, loss, through anger and rebuilding and letting go, but I made it. And that version of me, the one who used to cry quietly in bathrooms and shrink herself to fit someone else's narrative, she'd be proud of the woman I've become. Sometimes I think about the choices that led me here, the moments where I could have stayed silent, could have folded, could have chosen fear, but I didn't. I chose truth, I chose myself. And in doing so, I chose peace. That, above all, is the victory. Last month, I took a solo trip to Iceland, something I'd always dreamed about but never dared to do when I was married. Back then, I worried too much about what others would say, how it would look, whether Chris would approve. Now, I book the flight, pack my boots, and go. There was one moment in particular, standing alone near a black sand beach, the wind howling around me, volcanic cliffs towering in the distance, where I felt something shift deep inside me. For the first time, I saw myself not as someone who had been broken and rebuilt, but as someone who had chosen to evolve. There's a difference. To be broken is to have something done to you. To evolve is to choose growth. Again and again, even when it hurts, even when it's lonely, even when there's no map. And I've chosen growth every step of the way. If I could go back and speak to my younger self, the woman standing in that kitchen, trembling with truth, unsure if telling it would end everything, I'd take her hand and whisper, say it anyway, your peace is waiting. Because now I know peace isn't passive, it's a choice. One we must make daily. And I choose it over and over again.